With Nigeria. For days now, we have been telling you about the ongoing youth-led demonstrations in East Africa. From Kenya to Uganda, anti-government rallies have picked up pace in the region. They have also turned violent in Kenya, killing at least 50 people. But the Gen Z-led rallies are transcending boundaries. From East to West Africa, youngsters have been inspired and want to bring a change in their country. The Nigerian youth is now planning to carry out similar anti-government rallies. Many Nigerians are frustrated over the country's economic woes. They have taken to social media to mobilize protests from the 1st of August. The planned protests are dubbed End Bad Governance in Nigeria. They have a slew of demands, from tackling the cost of living crisis to offer free education, end insecurity, and disclose lawmakers' pay, among several others. But authorities in Nigeria are anxious. They fear the impending rallies and if the situation will turn violent. Rushing to quell anger, they went into a huddle, and security authorities in Nigeria held an emergency meeting on Wednesday to discuss a way to avoid the protests. Several officials, including 40 ministers, reportedly attended the meeting. As per reports, after the meeting, all federal ministers were directed to visit their respective states before the protests begin next week. While the government has pleaded for more time and patience to end economic hardships. Earlier, President Tinubu warned the youth against joining the protests. He said that the planned protests are the work of sinister people capitalizing on the country's economic woes. Nigeria's police chief had also warned against Kenyan-style protests. Nigeria, which is Africa's most populous country and a major economy, is grappling with a very high inflation of over 34%, while the food inflation is over 40%. The cost of living spiked after Tinubu ended a costly fuel subsidy and eased foreign exchange controls after he took charge in May of last year. Amidst the calls for rallies, Nigeria's National Assembly on Tuesday passed a bill to more than double the minimum wage for federal workers. The monthly minimum wage is now set to rise from 30,000 to 70,000 naira, or around $43. So the Nigerian government has already started to consider concessions and is buying time for more. As per reports, the Nigerian president has been urged to address the nation and acknowledge public grievances. But will he be able to gain the public trust in a week's time? To discuss further, we are being joined by Ambrose Igboke, a PhD and global affairs analyst. Ambrose joins us live from Enugu in Nigeria. Thank you for being with us, Ambrose.
Thank you, Alison, for having me. Good afternoon.
Now, we have seen protests in Kenya, Uganda, and now it seems that Nigeria is the next African country planning protests. Why are there growing calls for President Tinubu's resignation, and what economic challenges have fueled these protests?
Well, the protest that has been touted in Nigeria has not and is not calling for President Tinubu's resignation. I think that was what is happening in Kenya. For Nigerians, mostly, the protest is aimed at, reversing the awkward economic policies of the present administration, about reversing the hyperinflation in the country, about reversing the unemployment rate, about reversing the insecurity in the land. And these are the fulcrums and the main objectives of the planned protest by the protesters. You understand that in the last 15 months since the president took over, there have been multidimensional poverty has increased in Nigeria. We have had hyperinflation occasioned by a removal of the fuel subsidy and the floating of the naira against the dollar. Because Nigeria has failed to make its refineries work. And basically, that is the work of government, to make the refineries work that was built by public money. For the past 30 years, the refineries have refused to work. all the turnaround maintenances that were, monies were, budgeted for, billions for turnaround maintenances of the 4 refineries in Nigeria, none was working. Nigeria is basically the only organizing petroleum exporting countries, OPEC nations, that, exports crude for its own consumption, exports crude, refines the product outside the country with dollar-denominated amount, and bring it back again using dollars, and then expect to sell it in naira. Nigeria is the only OPEC country that basically does not refine its own domestic petroleum consumption in their country. And so it's an economic absurdity that a country takes its own petroleum product out and brings it in refined. So that makes the cost skyrocketed. So the government knew that they have failed in refining product locally. They now introduced the subsidy, which was supposed to bring down the cost of pricing when you make it at par with international pricing. But when you now remove it, what government now did was to remove the subsidy without actually putting those refineries in working conditions. And what we are now telling Nigerians is to buy petroleum products at the price of international markets. For an oil producing nation, that is not a fair economic path, because we are supposed to enjoy the advantages of an oil producing nation. We cannot be buying petroleum at the cost of what others who are not producing petroleum are buying. So Nigerians have seen that the first subsidy in the first place, the subsidy was not the problem. It was the fraud in the subsidy. So what the government ought to have done was to ensure that they remove the fraud in the subsidy, because the subsidy itself is a failure of government to make the refineries work. So it's not the Nigerian citizen that will suffer for the inefficiency of government in that regard. And that is why things have skyrocketed in the last 15 months.
Right.
By the time the government entered, we are buying fuel for 165 naira per liter of PMS. And then by July last year, we are buying for 600. Calculate the inflation rate. That was too much. For a country that lacks power, electricity power that depends mostly on diesel and petrol, it was a big thing for us, and it's really biting hard economically.
Right. Let me interrupt you there. What are these? Let's take a look at these key demands of the planned protests in terms of how they relate to issues like security concerns, transparency in governance, and accountability.
Well, the issue of insecurity has started by when the ISWAP and some other insurgent groups gathered from the part of Niger, Chad, and infiltrated Nigeria from the north of Nigeria. And because of that, it was contained in the north before, but it has spread throughout the country, where they now enter farmlands, sack communities, kill people. There's a killing spree every time. And because of that, the economic activities, especially crop production, has greatly reduced in Nigeria. People are not able to go to their farms again because of fear of being massacred, being killed in their farms. And that has also, encroached in the food production. And now we are having death of food crisis problem, come up because of the issues of insecurity. Farmers can no longer access their farms. And this has caused a lot. Kidnappings are still on in the land. And so these are the key demands also, that Nigerians need to be safe. Nigerians need to, go to sleep with their two eyes closed. But right now, people are agitated, people are afraid, people are hungry. There's a lot of, discontent in the land. And that is one of the key areas that the state government should look into.
Right.
So far, these areas subsist, and that is the problem. One of some of the major problems. When you talk of transparency in governance, we have what they call the Freedom of Information Act or law in Nigeria. That is just like a window dressing. Nothing is happening. You need to apply for you to get information. Before you get the information, it is so hard. Journalists find it difficult to access things that are supposed to be public information. Our lawmakers, we don't know how much is the allowances. We don't know how much they are earning. A lot of things are still shrouded in secrecy. There's an opaque nature. People still take oath in governance not to reveal secret act oaths and all those things. Laws that are not in tandem with 21st century movement. These are the things that ought to go. We need to know. In fact, it needs to be published. in the website of government what each person is earning. So now we can know. As I speak, I don't know what the lawmakers are earning in allowances, and then when you try to find out, you meet a brick wall. And that is one of the problems. There's no transparency is a big issue in governance in the country.
Right, absolutely. And Ambrose, we have seen some concessions from the government in Nigeria in terms of the youth, citizens' willingness, especially among the youth, to participate in these protests. What measures are being taken to ensure safety during the demonstrations?
In Nigeria's constitution and in the democracy practiced in Nigeria, protest is one of the legitimate means by which citizens can, ventilate their discontent with government. And that is taken, and that is given in the Nigerian constitution. But in the past, what we have had was that when protests take place, some fifth columnists infiltrate the protesters and try to make it a riot. And that is one of the biggest problems. So instead of Nigerian government saying that people should not protest, how else do you want people to ventilate their anger? How else do you want people to ventilate their frustrations and discontent? So instead of government saying, do not protest, the government should be saying, how do we protect protesters? I think that should be the dialogue and the narrative, not do not protest. If there's a proverb in Africa that you don't beat a child and tell a child not to cry. So the people are already crying. The people are angry. The people are, frustrated. And the only way they are seeing in a democratic setting is for the protests. So the security agency should try to ensure that whatever protest that may take place should be within the ambit of the law. Should be, there should be adequate security to ensure that fifth columnists who are trying to use the protest as a way of causing disquiet in the land are not allowed to use it. But they have to make sure that the protesters are properly, protected, and that is the way modern democracy is done. Because even those in government today were beneficiaries of protest. The president himself was a well-known protester in the days of Abacha time in the 90s, and even recently, some 15 years ago, when they protested against the government of Jonathan when they wanted to remove fresh subsidy. So protests are well known. Nigerians are well known for protests. They protested against the military regime. They have been protesting. So it's not a new thing in Nigeria, but we are saying that the government